Gender activist Lisa Vetten has said she's disappointed with some of the proposed new laws on sexual and domestic violence. There's been much focus recently on gender-based violence in South Africa, heightened by the intense lockdown regulations as a result of COVID-19. Yesterday, the Department of Justice briefed the Portfolio Committee on Justice and Correctional Services on the new amendments. Lisa Vetten joins us now, and of course she's a research associate at the University of Johannesburg. Lisa, good evening, and thank you so much for your time. There were two specific laws, of course, that went before Parliament yesterday, and MPs were discussing and, I suppose, in many ways also giving feedback on those amendments. Let's talk about what they were and perhaps some of your own feelings about them.
Well, I think the amendments seem to suggest that, for the most part, government has now lapsed into knee-jerk legislation. By that I mean they're looking at what do they think is the kind of law that will please people with strong opinions in the population, rather than looking at what is the actual problem and how can law solve it, and do we have evidence that this particular legal approach will solve the problem that we're trying to address.
Of course. So sure, go ahead, Lisa, go ahead.
So, for example, in relation to the Domestic Violence Act, the amendments propose making it introducing mandatory reporting. So anybody who knows or suspects that a woman is being abused by her partner is required to go and report this to the police or a social worker. If they don't do so, they can be prosecuted for a crime. Now, if you look at the World Health Organization's assessment internationally of what is good lawmaking, they are very clear that mandatory reporting is bad practice, and they discourage countries from pursuing it. So the question is, why is South Africa then doing that when there is a consensus that that is not good law?
Mm-hmm. And of course, it's not just on the issues of bad practice that there has been, on best practice rather, where there has been some deviation. But we also, of course, have concerns about the extent to which the South African police in particular are going to be able to enforce some of the changes that are included within the amendments.
That, I think, is a very real concern. I think they only are making arrests in about 57% of rape cases anyway. And if you consider that getting onto the sex offenders register requires an arrest, a matter being referred to court, and a prosecution that results in a conviction, quite clearly putting a lot of emphasis on trying to get sex offenders on registers is not that effective when you consider how many cases aren't even resulting in arrests at this point in time.
What are the silver linings? Because in many respects, when you speak to the Justice Department, they're saying these pieces of legislation are supposed to put South Africa on a path where the criminal justice system becomes more victim-centered and therefore is more responsive to the needs of the victims and not necessarily seen to be more protective of perpetrators. Is that the case?
No, I wouldn't say so. I think if they wanted to do that in relation to sexual offences, for example, then they should have looked at how do we make our legal system more inquisitorial and move away from such a harsh, antagonistic, adversarial system. That would have made victims' experience in the system a whole lot better, rather than the idea of let's make a sex offenders register and put as many people as we can on it. Given the fact that we are only convicting roughly 8% of all, in 8% of all rape cases, there really isn't that much value to it, and nor is it necessarily going to make victims feel that much safer. There are some useful ideas in the Domestic Violence Act. Sorry.
Sure, go ahead, Lisa, go ahead.
I mean, I think there are elements of the Domestic Violence Act where the amendments are useful. For instance, being able to make online applications, for instance. That's potentially very helpful, and I think giving guidance to the police on arresting. Those things are useful, but unfortunately, I don't think there's been a comprehensive look at what would really make a difference to victims. This is more about how do we appease an angry population.
How much of the success of these amendments also rests on the ability of the South African Police Service? So I suppose what I'm asking you, beyond what we touched on earlier, is how much of this relies also on reform within the South African Police Service in order to give true effect to what has been passed as legislation?
A great deal. I mean, I think the police's ability to implement the Domestic Violence Act has come under a great deal of criticism, and we've seen a certain number of women who've died with protection orders due to the lack of police action. So that's a very significant problem, which is not addressed by the proposed amendments. I think all the issues you've raised around the ability to arrest, to effectively investigate cases is another problem. And of course, I think it's going to be really important to look at how the police are trained to interpret this new piece of legislation, this new crime, sexual intimidation. And lastly, you're also going to have to look at how well the police and the prosecution do in denying bail to those who are accused of crimes of domestic violence.